We have to talk about economics, and like, I hate it. I hate it so much. We gotta talk about a thing called mercantilism. Okay, so mercantilism is this idea that's rising in Europe, and it seems really stupid and really obvious now, but it's just the idea that like trade on its own can create wealth and power for a nation. So up until this point throughout world history, it's been like land, it's been how many people do you rule, that sort of thing. But now what Europe is doing is they're like, no, just controlling trade routes and controlling, you know, the flow of gold and silver and that sort of thing can on its own create power. That's new. So a lot of European states are actively promoting trade, and they're promoting, you know, exploration and setting up these like chartered companies, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, whatever, to promote mercantilism as long as the trade goes through the mother country. That's gonna like annoy us later when we want to, I don't know, have our revolution. So England is unique on top of that, right? This is already kind of a unique thing Europe is doing, is actively promoting all of this trade as a source of wealth and power. England is even more unique because they are a constitutional monarchy, at least by the end of the 1600s for sure. And what this means, like, it's no coincidence that John Locke, the English philosopher, he said that we have a right to life, liberty, and property. Not happiness, property, right? Because he understood that if you were an entrepreneur, if you wanted to be a risk taker, you were more willing to do that if you felt certain that your property, your money, your wealth was going to be protected and not taken from the government. Which the first permanent English colony in the New World is Jamestown. Is founded in 1607. I say permanent because I'll do a video on Roanoke later, but it's founded in a marsh on the James River. No one's really thinking they're going to be there for a very long time. The first governor goes there and just wants to find gold. He's emphatic that there's gold in these hills, whatever. If they didn't have the support sometimes of the Powhatan Confederacy, that's Pocahontas' tribe, again, more on her in a later video, then they would have died way faster. I mean, they died, a lot of them died, but they would have died even faster than they already did. And so he's out just trying to find gold. People are starving. They're not able to feed themselves. At that point, John Smith takes over, and John Smith's whole claim to fame is just that no one died when he was in charge. So good job, John. But a little bit more evidence of that is that as soon as John Smith leaves, he is asked to go back to England. And I'll explain a little bit more of that in my Pocahontas video. Then Jamestown enters what is known as the starving times. Literally, like, they are dying in droves. Some of the records tell us that at any given time, only 4 or 5 people are healthy enough to even like bury the dead bodies. They're actually like eating cats and dogs. They're not eating like cats and dogs. They are eating cats and dogs. They even resort to having to eat some of the dead bodies of the settlers who died. It was not great. They were packing up and on a ship ready to go when finally then a ship with supplies comes back in, and so then they get settled and they stay. And that's our first call. We gotta talk about Pocahontas for a second. So Pocahontas was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, the chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, and she did save John Smith's life. John Smith was about to be executed, more on that in a second, and then Pocahontas stepped in and was like, no. But we should probably understand this, at least based on the experts that I've looked into about this. They say this is probably a ceremonial thing. What that means is that Chief Powhatan was trying to kind of assert his dominance and show his mercy to the colonists. And so he was like about to execute John Smith, and then this orchestrated kind of ceremonial saving occurred. Now again, you know, we're not entirely sure what happened on that day, and John Smith probably didn't know that it was ceremonial if it was, so he was probably terrified and very grateful for Pocahontas. She did also, in theory, save John Smith's life again because she warned him about an ambush that her father was planning. So there definitely seemed to be some sort of relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith. When he left and was forced to go back to England, she was told that he died. Pocahontas ended up marrying John Rolfe. There's so many Johns. He's the guy that ended up revolutionizing tobacco growing in Virginia, which made the colony profitable. As were most marriages at the time, this is a political marriage, probably some sort of alliance between the Powhatan Confederacy and the settlers. Pocahontas ends up going back and living the rest of her life in England with John Rolfe and their baby Thomas, and she's sort of treated like this just strange novelty princess. But supposedly she was at a party in England and she ran into John Smith, and she was so surprised because she thought he'd been dead this whole time that she was overcome with emotion, according to onlookers. But then she started like yelling at him because John Smith had been kind of like increasing threats to her people, which is one of the reasons why the tensions were rising anyway, and then she had to go save him. Anyway, they definitely seem to have some sort of really interesting relationship, but it's probably not exactly what Disney showed us because, you know, it's Disney. We've talked about Jamestown, we've talked about the Virginia colony, which is going to go on to become sort of emblematic for all of the Chesapeake and Southern colonies that are founded for mostly economic purposes. And that's one really important part of the growing American identity, right? This like rags to riches, if I can get there, I can make it sort of attitude, whether or not that's actually true. So on that same note, we need to talk about, I think, the other kind of linchpin colony for really understanding colonial America and the developing American identity, which is Plymouth, which becomes part of the bigger Massachusetts Bay colonies. So just in the same way that to understand Jamestown and then the Virginia colony, we had to understand mercantilism. To understand Plymouth, which becomes part of the Massachusetts colony, we need to understand Protestantism, and especially what it means to be a Puritan. So if you remember in the early 1500s, the Protestant Reformation was going on. A lot of different groups were breaking away from the Catholic Church. One of those was Henry VIII of England. He creates the Anglican Church, partly to divorce his wife, but more broadly just to gain power and wealth, right? He takes over now as the head of the church. So there were a group of people within England especially who felt like the Anglican Church or the Church of England didn't go far enough. They wanted to purify it even more. We call them Puritans. So in 1620, a group of Puritans and other people arrived in Plymouth. They founded the Plymouth colony. I want to be really clear, the Plymouth colony wasn't actually very successful. It's going to be absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay colony. But again, just in the same way that there was this dichotomy in 1619 in Virginia between the House of Burgesses and then the arrival of enslaved Africans, there's also a dichotomy in puritanical New England between democracy, but also like intolerance. One of the greatest myths that Americans have about our founding is that we were founded on the principle of religious freedom. No, we weren't. We were not. We were founded, especially in New England, on the principle of the freedom of Protestants to create a Protestant society. For example, to be a member of the congregation, you had to be a white male, and you also had to be admitted in by an existing member of the congregation. But at the same time, again, sort of strangely, puritanical Massachusetts was relatively democratic, especially compared to the rest of the world at the time. Because if you were a member of that congregation, you could now vote. They had town halls, they had town meetings. And so again, this is where we also see the birthplace of this new American sort of style of democracy, although it's super, super, super limited. For example, even the Mayflower Compact, which is this historic, very important kind of first democratic document in the New World in a lot of ways, well, it was really signed by the people on the Mayflower. It is signed by the Puritans because they knew they had a simple majority over non-Puritan people on that ship, who they called strangers. And so they signed this Mayflower Compact basically promising to do a majority rule government because they wanted to be able to outrule the non-Puritans. So again, the United States is this weird dichotomy of like freedom and intolerance all wrapped up into one. We see that both in Jamestown and Plymouth. All right, TikTok Summer School, let's go ahead and just like recap the colonies. I'm not going to go through all 13 of them so that we can get to this revolution. That's what we all really want to do. So to vastly oversimplify, most of the southern colonies, kind of from Virginia-ish down, are based on young men wanting adventure, land, wealth, that sort of thing. They're going to maintain closer ties to England out of economic necessity, but also like cultural connections. A lot of those young men, go back to England to find a wife, and then they move back there. They're back and forth. Whereas in the New England colonies, these are more going to be founded by small families who are there and wanting to stay and wanting to move away from England. So already we're seeing that in kind of the northern colonies, they're going to be more easily distanced culturally, politically, socially, economically from Mother England. We have in the South the rise of a slave economy growing on these southern plantations, but that's being fueled and financed by northern colonies who are actively financing, they're actively trading in the enslaved people. All of the 13 colonies are benefiting off of enslaved labor. There are some attempts to create a more free and equitable society in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, which is founded by Quakers. Also Maryland, which is a Catholic colony, which is founded on the idea of religious toleration for Catholics. Although very quickly, once they establish religious toleration, Protestants overrun the colony and then kick the Catholics out. So it doesn't work that well. So by the early 1700s, I want to really emphasize this. We have 13 completely separate colonies, right? They all have their own charters. They're all founded by different people for different reasons. They have different governments. Again, their only thing in common is geography, and that a lot of them were founded by people from England. But by the 1700s, they are completely diverse and distinct and different. But there are going to be a few things happening in the middle of the 1700s that are going to push them to unite. Forever? I don't know.